The courtroom was alive with the usual hum of anticipation. Lawyers rustling papers, spectators whispering in hushed tones, and the distant sound of a gavel striking in another chamber. Judge Margaret Collins sat at the bench, her gaze steady and professional. It was another day, another case. At least, that's what she thought. The bailiff called the case, "The State of New York versus Robert Mitchell." Margaret shifted slightly in her seat, her hands resting on the polished mahogany of the bench. She glanced at the charges in front of her. Assault, robbery, resisting arrest. A familiar ache of disappointment settled in her chest. Another lost soul tangled in the system, she thought. When the defendant was brought in, her world tilted. The man standing before her, shackled at the wrists and ankles, was not a stranger. He was Robert Mitchell, her Robert. Her throat tightened as a flood of memories surged forward. The winter evenings they spent racing sleds down the snowy hills of Buffalo, New York, the late-night talks under the oak tree in her backyard, the promises they made as kids to always have each other's backs no matter what. She could still hear his laughter, bright and unguarded, as they tumbled into snowbanks, their breath clouding in the frosty air. "You're going to be somebody big, Maggie," he'd said once, his eyes gleaming with belief. "And I'll be right there cheering." But the man standing before her wasn't the boy she remembered. His shoulders were hunched, his face lined with years of hardship, yet his eyes, those deep, soulful eyes, were unmistakable. Margaret's grip on the gavel faltered. For the first time in her career, she hesitated. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in as she tried to process the impossible. Robert looked up, his expression a mixture of shock and resignation. Recognition flickered in his eyes, but he quickly looked away, his head bowing slightly. For a fleeting moment their gazes locked, and Margaret saw a spark of the boy she'd known, a silent plea that pierced her heart. The courtroom waited. Margaret forced herself to speak. "Mr. Mitchell, you stand accused of assault and robbery. How do you plead?" Robert's voice was rough, almost unrecognizable. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Her heart pounded. She wanted to stop everything, to demand answers. What had happened to him? How had their paths diverged so drastically? But her role as a judge demanded composure. "Proceed," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. As the prosecutor began their opening statements, Margaret's mind raced. This wasn't just any case. This was Robert, and somehow she had to figure out how to separate her past from her present before it was too late. The courtroom blurred as Margaret's mind drifted to a time long before her black robes and the gavel in her hand. She and Robert had grown up on opposite sides of Buffalo, New York, divided not by distance, but by the unspoken rules of their segregated town. Her family's house was a modest two-story with a chain-link fence, while Robert's family lived in a weathered apartment at the end of a paved street, surrounded by factories. Their friendship had been an anomaly. She remembered how they met, an accidental encounter at the edge of a frozen pond where she had wandered too far from her own backyard. Robert had been skating, his laces tangled in the ice. She had offered to help, and that simple gesture had turned into years of secret adventures and shared dreams. "Margaret," he at once said, lying on the snow beside her under the stars, "you ever think about leaving this place? Like really getting out, going somewhere people don't look at us funny just for sitting together?" She'd felt a pang even then, knowing their world was crueler than her young heart wanted to admit. "We'll make our own place, Rob," she'd promised, her voice fierce with childish defiance. "Just you and me." She had laughed then, brushing off the idea, but Robert wasn't joking. Even as a child, he saw the world for what it was, a place that didn't always make room for people like him. Their bond deepened despite the whispers, the sideways glances, and the outright disapproval from both sides. But the pressure was always there, like a weight neither of them could shake. And then, one day, it all ended. It was the winter before middle school, when Margaret's father caught them sitting on the porch together. His voice had been cold, sharp with authority. "Margaret, get inside now." She'd hesitated, glancing at Robert, who stood frozen in place. "Go on," he had said quietly, his voice tinged with resignation. "I'll see you around." Her heart had screamed to stay, to defy her father's command, but fear had won. As she stepped inside, she'd caught Robert's gaze one last time, a look of betrayal that haunted her for years. They hadn't seen each other again, not really. Her father forbade her from going near Robert, and soon after Robert's family moved away. Margaret threw herself into school, her ambitions carrying her far beyond the town of Buffalo. She went to law school, chasing dreams of justice and fairness, but she never forgot the boy who had taught her what courage looked like. Some nights, alone in her dorm, she'd pull out an old photo of them, their arms slung around each other, grinning at the camera. She'd trace his smile and wonder where he was, if he still believed in the dreams they'd shared. Now, sitting on the bench, she wondered what had become of Robert after she'd walked into that house and closed the door on their friendship. His record showed a series of arrests for minor offenses, petty theft, loitering, nothing that screamed a violent nature. But then again, how much of someone's life could you see in a few lines on a rap sheet? The prosecutor's voice snapped her back to the present. He was describing the alleged crime. Robert was accused of assaulting a store clerk during a robbery at a convenience store in Albany. The clerk had suffered minor injuries, and the cash register had been emptied. Robert was picked up a few blocks away, the cash allegedly still in his possession. Margaret studied Robert as the prosecutor spoke. His posture was slouched, his hands clasped in front of him, but his expression was unreadable. Did he really do it, or was there more to the story than what the prosecution claimed? The courtroom adjourned for a lunch break, giving Margaret a moment to gather her thoughts. As she returned to her chambers, her assistant Susan approached with a hesitant expression. "Judge Collins, are you okay? You seemed a little distracted," Susan asked. Margaret hesitated. Should she confide in Susan? Would it be unprofessional to admit that she knew the defendant? Instead, she shook her head. "I'm fine, just a lot on my mind." But she wasn't fine. How could she be when every glance at Robert felt like a knife twisting in her chest, reminding her of the promises she'd broken? The courtroom was packed when the trial resumed. Reporters scribbled notes, the clerk shuffled papers, and the prosecutor, a sharp-faced man named Thomas Reed, was ready to deliver his case. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Reed began, his voice firm. "This case is about violence. It's about a man who walked into a convenience store and, without provocation, attacked an innocent clerk before stealing the cash register contents. The evidence will show that Robert Mitchell is guilty of this crime." Margaret felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The prosecutor's tone was clinical, detached, as if Robert were nothing more than a name on a docket. She glanced at Robert, whose gaze remained fixed on the table before him. The defense attorney, Emily Carter, rose to present her opening statement. She was young but confident, with a voice that carried across the room. "The prosecution would have you believe this case is straightforward, but it's not. My client, Robert Mitchell, has maintained his innocence from the start. We will show that there is more to this story and that assumptions made on the night of the arrest do not hold up under scrutiny." The first witness was called to the stand, a store clerk who had been working on the night of the incident. He described seeing a man fitting Robert's description enter the store, argue with the cashier, and then lunge over the counter. His testimony was detailed, but something about it felt rehearsed. Emily's cross-examination was surgical. "Mr. Thompson, you stated that the man who attacked the clerk was wearing a red hoodie. Is that correct?" "Yes," the witness replied. "Did you see his face clearly?" "Not really. It was dark and he had the hood up." Emily nodded, pacing slightly. "So, you're saying you couldn't definitively identify the individual who committed the assault?" "Well, no, but—" "No further questions," Emily said, cutting him off. Margaret noticed Robert shift slightly in his seat, his shoulders squaring as if the exchange had given him a small glimmer of hope. The next piece of evidence was a surveillance video from the store. The footage was grainy and poorly lit, showing a figure in a red hoodie entering the store. The prosecution argued that the person in the video was Robert, but the quality made it difficult to discern any identifying features. As the video played, Margaret studied it intently. Could this truly be Robert? The figure moved quickly, grabbing at the counter before disappearing off screen. The footage ended abruptly, leaving an unsettling gap in the narrative. Robert's defense was based on an alibi. He claimed he had been walking home from a friend's house at the time of the robbery. The friend, however, was unwilling to testify, citing fear of retaliation from the community. Emily argued that the lack of a willing witness didn't negate Robert's innocence, but the jury's expressions hinted at skepticism. As the trial wore on, Margaret felt the weight of her position pressing down on her. She was meant to be impartial, a pillar of fairness, but how could she be when every moment reminded her of their childhood? She remembered a promise she'd made to Robert under that oak tree. "No matter what, we'll always protect each other." The words echoed now, mocking her as she sat in judgment over him. The boy who had once been her closest friend was now a man fighting for his freedom, and she was the one tasked with determining his fate. When the court adjourned for the day, Margaret lingered at the bench, her fingers tracing the edges of the gavel. She wanted to talk to Robert, to ask him directly what had happened, but she knew she couldn't. Any contact outside the courtroom would jeopardize the case and her career. As she watched Robert being escorted out of the room in shackles, Margaret's resolve wavered. She had always believed in the justice system, in its ability to reveal the truth, but for the first time, she wondered if the truth was something it could ever truly grasp. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as the trial reached a pivotal moment. It was the defense's turn to present their case, and Emily Carter called her first key witness, Officer Michael Thompson, the arresting officer. Margaret leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. This was where the cracks, if any, might begin to show. Officer Thompson, a burly man with a gruff demeanor, took the stand. Emily approached him with deliberate calm. "Officer Thompson," she began, "you were the one who apprehended my client, correct?" "That's right," he replied, his tone clipped. "You stated in your report that Mr. Mitchell was walking 2 blocks from the scene of the robbery when you detained him. Is that correct?" "Yes." "And what led you to believe he was the suspect?" Thompson shifted in his seat. "He matched the description, a black male, mid-40s, wearing dark clothing." Emily's eyebrows raised slightly. "Dark clothing, but the suspect in the video was described as wearing a red hoodie. Did you find a red hoodie in Mr. Mitchell's possession when you searched him?" Thompson hesitated. "No, but he could have discarded it." Emily took a step closer. "Could have? Did you or any other officer conduct a search of the surrounding area to locate this supposed hoodie?" Thompson's jaw tightened. "No, we didn't have time. He was apprehended quickly," Emily pressed on. "So, to clarify, you arrested my client based on a vague description without physical evidence linking him to the scene?" The officer's silence spoke louder than any words. Margaret's gaze flickered to the jury. A few members exchanged uncertain glances. Emily wasn't done. "Officer Thompson, do you recall if Mr. Mitchell said anything at the time of his arrest?" He protested, said he was innocent. "And did you consider investigating his claim, or did you assume guilt based solely on his appearance?" Thompson's face reddened. "I followed protocol." "Protocol," Emily repeated, her voice laced with skepticism. "No further questions, Your Honor." The courtroom buzzed again as Thompson stepped down, his credibility visibly shaken. Margaret's heart pounded. This was more than just a trial now. It was a reckoning. Not just for Robert, but for a system that seemed too eager to condemn him. She caught Robert's eye for a split second, and the raw pain in his gaze made her chest ache. Was he blaming her for sitting there, silent, as his life hung in the balance? The defense's next move was unexpected. Emily introduced an expert witness, a forensic analyst who had reviewed the surveillance footage. The analyst explained that, based on the height and build of the individual in the video, there was no definitive way to confirm it was Robert. Furthermore, the timestamp on the footage had been altered, raising questions about its reliability. The prosecutor attempted to dismiss the testimony as conjecture, but the jury appeared unsettled. A shadow of doubt crept into the room, and Margaret could feel its weight. As the day drew to a close, Robert was given the opportunity to testify on his own behalf. Emily had warned him of the risks, but Robert insisted. He stood, chains clinking softly as he approached the stand. His voice, though quiet, carried a raw sincerity. "I've made mistakes in my life," Robert began, addressing the jury directly. "I've taken wrong turns, trusted the wrong people. But I didn't do this. That night I was walking home, minding my own business, when the cops stopped me. They didn't ask questions, they just decided I fit the bill." His voice cracked slightly as he continued. "I've been fighting my whole life, fighting to be seen as more than what people assume about me. But this? I'm tired. I just want the truth to matter." He paused, his eyes briefly meeting Margaret's. "I trusted someone once, thought we'd always have each other's backs, but life doesn't work that way, does it?" Margaret's throat tightened as Robert sat back down. His words hung in the air. A plea not just for justice, but for humanity. She glanced at the jury, their faces a mix of emotions, doubt, empathy, and uncertainty. This was it. The truth was no longer confined to evidence or testimonies. It was a battle of conscience, a struggle against the weight of prejudice and assumption. Margaret knew that her role wasn't just to uphold the law, it was to interpret it in a way that served true justice. The final day of the trial dawned heavy with anticipation. The closing arguments were delivered with precision. The prosecutor leaned on the circumstantial evidence, urging the jury to trust the system's process. Emily, however, pleaded for the jury to see beyond the surface, to consider the holes in the case and the humanity of the man on trial. Margaret listened intently, her face impassive but her mind racing. Her role was clear. She could not sway the jury, but she would have the final word if their verdict left room for interpretation. The burden of ensuring justice weighed heavily on her. The jury deliberated for hours. The courtroom emptied and refilled as people stretched their legs or whispered among themselves. Robert sat quietly, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He hadn't looked at Margaret since the first day of the trial, and she couldn't blame him. But now, as the tension mounted, she felt an urge to speak, to bridge the chasm between them. Yet she stayed silent, bound by duty. Finally, the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict. The room fell silent as the foreperson stood, a piece of paper trembling in her hands. In the case of the state of New York versus Robert Mitchell, we find the defendant. The pause was unbearable. Not guilty. The room erupted in a mix of gasps, murmurs, and even a few cheers. Margaret tapped her gavel, restoring order. Robert's shoulders sagged, as if a weight had been lifted, but his face remained unreadable. He had won his freedom, but it was clear this victory came at a cost. Margaret addressed the court, her voice steady. The jury has spoken. Mr. Mitchell, you are free to go. Court is adjourned. As the courtroom emptied, Margaret lingered behind, watching Robert as he signed his release paperwork. For a moment, she thought he might leave without a word, but then he turned and approached her. The room was nearly empty now, just a few clerks tidying up and Susan gathering files. Robert stopped a few feet from the bench, his expression guarded. You don't owe me anything, he said quietly, but I'd like to know, why didn't you say anything? You knew me. Margaret felt her throat tighten, the words catching. Because I couldn't? I had to be fair. If I'd said something, it might have jeopardized the case. Robert studied her, his face a mix of hurt and understanding. Fair? He repeated. That's the thing, Margaret. The world's never been fair, not for people like me. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. You were my best friend, Maggie. When you walked away that day, I thought I'd lost everything, and now I'm still losing. She nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to the polished wood of the bench. You're right. I wish I'd done more back then. I wish I could have done more now, Robert sighed, the tension in his posture easing slightly. We were kids. We didn't know any better. But you know now, don't you? I do, Margaret said, her voice firm. And I'm sorry. Tears stung her eyes, but she held them back. I never stopped caring, Rob. I just got lost in trying to fix a world I didn't understand. Robert gave a faint nod, then turned and walked away, his back straight as he disappeared through the courthouse doors. Margaret sat alone in the empty courtroom, the weight of his words pressing on her. She had upheld the law, but the trial had revealed a deeper truth. Justice wasn't just about verdicts and evidence. It was about the lives shaped by systems far larger than any one person. For Margaret, it was a wake-up call, a reminder that her position wasn't just a seat of power, but a platform for change. As she left the courtroom that evening, the fading sun casting long shadows across the courthouse steps, Margaret made a silent vow. She couldn't change the past, but she would do everything in her power to ensure the future held more than hollow promises of fairness. It would be hard, perhaps even impossible, but she owed it to Robert and to herself to try.